everyone, I'm Rebecca and welcome back to my channel. Over the past couple of months of making my various American Girl cosplays, I have received many requests from you all to do a video about American Girl in general and my history with the brand, like how it inspired me and started me off on my historical costuming journey. Many of you have also asked to see more of my American Girl collection, so although this is definitely not my usual content, I've decided that I will cover all of that in this video. Let's start with a brief background about American Girl. American Girl began as a set of historical books and dolls created by Pleasant Rowland in 1986. There were 3 dolls, Kirsten, Samantha, and Molly, and each doll had 6 short chapter books, about 60 pages or so per book, that told her story. Each doll's story was set in a different time in history, and each doll also had a collection of various outfits and play sets that could be purchased, all of which were showcased in the American Girl catalog. I first started getting into American Girl when I was about 6 years old, around 1994. By this time, there were 5 dolls and 5 sets of stories, having added Felicity and Addy to the lineup. I'll go into more detail about each doll a little later in the video, by the way. These were the first chapter books I ever read, and since my family has always been huge fans of history, it was no wonder that the books appealed to me so much. The stories are all very well researched, with lots of details about the time period within the doll story, plus several pages in the back of the book that go more in depth on specific elements of that time period. A lot of the books also share many details about the fashions of that period, and most of those fashions that were described within the books were outfits that you could then purchase for the dolls, and thus they were also shown in the free catalog that American Girl regularly sent out. Now, one thing about American Girl dolls, for a toy, they were, and honestly still are, quite expensive. I think I remember the dolls being around $90 or so when I was a kid. The doll came in one outfit, her meet outfit, which was the same outfit depicted on the cover of her first book. That book, which would be titled Meet Felicity, Meet Samantha, etc., came with the doll as well. Additional outfits were in the $20 to $30 range. So, in other words, this was a very big and expensive gift, at least in my family's eyes. And to get a gift that big, you have to prove that you are responsible enough to care for it. These dolls, by the way, are intended for ages 8 and up. So even though I got into these stories as a 6-year-old, it took a couple of years before I ever received my first doll. In the meantime, what I did have were the American Girl paper dolls. Now, I don't remember exactly which ones I had, but I know I for sure had Samantha and Felicity, and I think maybe 1 or 2 of the others. And it just so happened that a couple of years later, when I was about 8 years old, my parents finally did give me my first doll, Samantha, along with one outfit, her winter cloak and gaiters, which was also the first American Girl outfit that I made for myself earlier this year. I'll link the playlist to all of my American Girl cosplays down below in the description, by the way, in case you want to check any of those out. Samantha's story begins in 1904, and she is an orphan who lives with her wealthy grandmother in New York State, and then later lives with her uncle and his wife in New York City. Her books deal with such topics as child labor because her friend Nellie, who later becomes her sister, works first as a maid next door and then in a factory, even though she is the same age as Samantha. I think Samantha's frilly Edwardian fashions really appealed a lot to me as a child, and I know I also really liked her story. Her fashions are nothing, though, compared to Felicity, which was the second doll that I was given as a child, along with her undergarment set, which consisted of fully boned stays, pocket hoops, and an embroidered pocket. Felicity's story is set in Williamsburg, Virginia from 1774 through 1776, so the earlier years of the American Revolution. I distinctly remember learning about such things as stays and pockets from her books and from her fashion, along with other historical fashions such as stomachers, since her fancy blue silk Christmas dress had 2 stomacher options. I also first learned about pattens from her story, which are protective slip-on shoes that are worn over your regular shoes in winter, with metal rings on the bottom to raise you up out of the mud and snow. Her clothing sets include things like caps, straw hats, mitts, pocket slits in her dresses, and other wonderful 18th century details. I am still blown away by how much research clearly went into her whole collection, because it's really quite remarkable. I wish I had a picture of it, but sometime around when I got Felicity, my family and I also took an East Coast trip that included a day at Williamsburg. And while I was there, I got a shift, a pinner apron, and a cap. And my mom, who does not sew, was able to make Felicity and I matching cotton flannel drawstring skirts so that we could match on Halloween. I think that may actually have been my first historical costume. Even though those were the only two dolls and the only official American Girl outfits that I ever owned as a child, I would drool over the beautiful pictures of the other fashions in the catalogs, and I am absolutely sure that it was the American Girl dolls and their stories that instilled my love of historical fashion in me, leading me to where I am today. As far as my journey with American Girl goes, though, after Felicity, I remember really wanting the newest doll that had just come out, Josefina, whose story takes place in 1824 in New Mexico. Her story deals a lot with loss, as her mother has just passed away shortly before the books take place, and it also addresses the daily life of living on a rancho in a Mexican territory, as this was before New Mexico became part of the US. I did not receive Josefina as a child, though, which was probably for the best, as my interest in the dolls began to wane not long after, and though I still received the catalogs through Kit's release in 2000, I was no longer actually playing with my dolls. So that brings us to now. Last year, in 2021, Mattel, who took over the company in 1998, re-released the original 6 dolls for the 35th anniversary of the original release, and I was very tempted at that time to get myself one of the new Kirsten dolls. Many of the dolls, including Kirsten, had been retired at various points over the years and replaced by other dolls representing other eras in history. I held off until Christmas last year when I did finally decide to buy myself a Kirsten, though I opted for a Pleasant Company Kirsten doll who had been made around the same time as my Felicity and my Samantha. Little did I know that this purchase would lead me down a slippery slope of American Girl doll and clothing collecting. Kirsten's story begins in 1854 as her family arrives in America from Sweden, before journeying west to Minnesota to live on a farm with her uncle and his family. Her books cover the many difficulties of being extremely poor farmers, as well as learning a new language and assimilating into the American culture at the time. Of course, purchasing Kirsten made me realize that her fashions, though cute, are really a bit boring for mid-Victorian outfits, and therefore I definitely needed to get myself Addy, who probably has the best wardrobe after Felicity, which makes sense since Addy's mom is a seamstress. Addy's story begins in 1864, as she and her mother escape from their enslaver in North Carolina and head north to freedom in Philadelphia, leaving the rest of their family behind. Besides slavery, her books also deal with poverty, racism, and learning to read. I've been rereading all of the older American Girl books and reading for the first time all the newer books over the last several months, and Addy's story is definitely one of the best and most important stories told in these books, and they're well worth a read, even for adults. After buying myself Addy back in January, my collection began to snowball a little bit. The next doll I purchased was Rebecca, who I had actually debated about getting even before getting Kirsten, but had decided against because she wasn't one that existed during my childhood when I was originally into American Girl, so the nostalgia factor wasn't there. However, it is almost a little scary how many elements of my family story are shared with Rebecca's story. Besides the fact that we share the same first name, Rebecca also wants to be an actress, and we both have brown curly hair because my hair is not naturally red. Her family is Jewish, and her parents immigrated from Russia to New York in the early 1900s, before she was born. My family also immigrated from Russia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, settling in various places in the East Coast, including New York City, with the earliest arriving in the late 1880s and the latest arriving in the early 1920s. Rebecca's dad even owned a shoe store, and my great-grandfather did as well. So even though Rebecca and her story didn't come out until 2009, I knew that I had to have her. After getting Rebecca in early February, I saved up for a few months to get Nellie, Samantha's friend who is later adopted as her sister. I just think that she is one of the most adorable dolls, and so I really had to have her. Somehow in June, I really grew my collection though. First, I purchased this Samantha doll, who is an early 1990s Samantha doll, with the intention of giving it to my friend Emily as a gift. But it turns out that I got her childhood favorite wrong, and it was Felicity she liked. So this Samantha wound up staying in my collection. Even though I still have my childhood Samantha, I feel like this one looks very different. She's considered a transitional Samantha doll, as prior to about 1991, the dolls had white bodies, but with the release of Felicity that year, who had lower cut gowns, the dolls' bodies were changed to tan. This Samantha came out in the very first year of those tan bodies and has lusher, lighter hair than my mid-90s Samantha, as well as a squishy vinyl face and limbs. Around that same time, before I knew I would be holding on to Samantha, I also found an amazing local deal on Elizabeth, who is Felicity's best friend, scoring the doll and a few of her outfits for less than the price than the doll usually goes for on eBay. eBay, by the way, is where most of the rest of my collection has come from. At the same time, I also got a really good deal on a Caroline doll. Caroline is actually one of my favorite dolls based on her stories. Her story begins in 1812 at the start of the War of 1812. In fact, she's out sailing with her dad on Lake Ontario, not knowing that the war has already started, and he's arrested by the British. She and her mom and grandma wind up taking over the running of their home and her father's shipyard, taking on a lot of responsibility during the war with the British. She unfortunately doesn't have that large of a collection of clothing since she was only available for a few years, but she has several really cute Regency looks, including this wonderfully detailed Spencer jacket. Last month, in July, I made my last doll purchase, Cecile. Cecile's story is unique in that she shares it with her best friend Marie Grace, though I don't have the Marie Grace doll, and their 6 books alternate back and forth between which girl is the main character for that individual book. Their stories take place in New Orleans beginning in 1853 and include dealing with the yellow fever epidemic that year, which was an event that I had never even heard of prior to reading their books. They also deal a lot with race because New Orleans was one of the few places in the US at that time where there was actually less disparity between blacks and whites, and there was a really large population of wealthy black people living in New Orleans at the time, and her family is part of that community. I have since also acquired this beat-up Josefina doll that someone was giving away locally a couple of weeks ago, which I've attempted to restore, both trying to tame her hair and also actually repainting the color into her face. Of all the dolls you've seen today, this and the older 1990s Samantha are the only ones not currently wearing their meet outfit, since this Josefina was wearing this Christmas dress when I got her. And that completes my collection of dolls. There are many other historical American Girl dolls as well, including Kaya, a Nez Perce girl whose story is set in the 1760s, Kit and her friend Ruthie, whose story is set during the Great Depression, Nenea, whose story takes place in Honolulu during the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Molly and her friend Emily, whose story takes place later during World War II, Mary Ellen from the 1950s, Melody, who in my opinion has some of the best books and whose story takes place during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, Julie from the 1970s, and Courtney from the 1980s. And actually just today that I'm filming this, American Girl has released their newest historical doll, Claudie, whose story takes place during the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. I don't have nearly as much interest in collecting any of these more modern girls as I'm not a big fan of their fashions. Okay, I love 1950s fashions, but honestly, Mary Ellen is one of the most annoying book characters, and if I let myself get one modern doll, then I might at some point want others, so I just figure I'm gonna close that door from the get-go. And since I've just lost my job, even my collecting of the more historical characters, such as Marie Grace, will have to stop at least for now. American Girl also has modern set stories called Girl of the Year, which started to be released in 2001, as well as dolls that you can purchase to just look like yourself or any specific hair, eye, face combo that you'd like, but I've never been interested in any of these. For me, it's all about the historical stories and, of course, the historical fashions. I hope that you've enjoyed this little video on my history with American Girl, along with a glance at my American Girl collection. I've very much enjoyed building this collection, as well as making the cosplays over the last few months. I do still plan to make Felicity's Christmas dress whenever I can find and afford that blue silk, but I don't really have any plans to make any other American Girl outfits at this time. So I want to know, do you collect American Girl? Or did you have any of the dolls in the past? Or had you never even heard of American Girl until I started doing these cosplay projects? I would love to know about your history with these dolls and their stories, so please do leave me comments down below. And if you're interested in more stories like this, I love the video that Melissa of Hat to Hem made a few months ago, so that video is linked down below in the description. If you liked this video though, please be sure to go ahead and click the thumbs up icon. And while I doubt that I'll ever have a video quite like this again, if you'd like to see other upcoming videos from me, including the last part of my Felicity cosplay series, please be sure to click the subscribe button and the little bell icon to be notified every time I post a new video. I do post videos here on YouTube twice a week, with my sewing vlogs out on Tuesdays and other random costume related content like this out on Saturdays, but I post every day over on my Instagram, so please go follow me on Instagram. That's at Lady Rebecca Fashions. And if you'd like to help support all of the work that I do on this channel, I do have a link to my Patreon and my Ko-fi down in the description below, or you can send me a super thanks right here on YouTube. I'd also like to give a special shout out to my Edwardian level patrons, Sharon, Julie, and Mirage. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you very soon in my next video. Happy sewing! And this is their closet that I keep their rather extensive wardrobe in, all in order of the year of each doll.